He was the biggest big cat abuser in the country, and now he's behind bars facing up to 30 years for more than a dozen counts of federal wildlife violations. Oh, as well as seeking 2 hit jobs for murder. The story of Joe Exotic and how PETA helped tame him on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, how the biggest big cat abuser in America called PETA to the witness stand to testify on his behalf. It was not a smart move.
What I've seen in my years of working to try to shut big cat abusers in particular down is it's one of the personality traits that they seem to have in common is narcissism, and I think that's one of the reasons too that many of these people are so brazen with what they do. They truly think that they're immune and that nothing bad could ever happen to them.
Brittany Peet, PETA's Director of Captive Animal Law Enforcement, a.k.a. CALE, is talking about Joe Maldonado Passage, a.k.a. Joe Exotic, who owned a roadside zoo in Oklahoma. It was there that a PETA eyewitness investigator documented how animals were kicked, deprived of food, blasted with pressurized hoses, and beaten with the blunt end of a gun. But Joe Exotic also treated big cats like breeding machines and became a primary supplier of big cat cubs for the cruel cub petting and cub selfie industry. This year, PETA helped bring Joe Exotic before the law. He was arrested and convicted on federal animal violations, but also 2 counts of murder for hire. He faces up to 30 years in prison. Pete knows Joe Exotic well, managed to rescue dozens of animals from him, and was even asked to be the only witness, other than Exotic himself, to testify on his behalf. Pete said she told the truth for the animals' sake. Here she is with how she came to testify for Joe Exotic on the PETA Podcast. So, Brittany, this Joe Exotic, let's start with the crime. Why did Joe Exotic, who's the owner of a rundown roadside in Oklahoma, take out a hit on someone or anyone? Well, why does anyone take out a hit on anyone? Who was he after? So
Joe Exotic was charged and convicted with 2 counts of murder for hire for taking out or attempting to hire 2 different people to kill Carol Baskin, who is the founder and executive director of Big Cat Rescue, which is an accredited sanctuary for abused and neglected big cats and wild cats in Tampa, Florida. And in addition to the wonderful rescue work that they do, they also have a very successful advocacy arm of their organization that, like PETA, goes after the biggest abuses for captive cats in the United States, including, like PETA, the big cat photo op industry.
So when Joe Exotic is in Oklahoma, Big Cat Rescue in Tampa, they find out about him and they go into action, no matter where he is, right?
Yeah, so I mean, this all started more than a decade ago, when Joe Exotic was the biggest breeder and seller of big cat cubs for the cub petting industry in the United States. At times, he had up to 200 big cats at his facility, many of whom were breeding, and he would not only sell the cats, but he also had his own major business of doing encounters and photo ops with big cat cubs. And at the time that Big Cat Rescue got involved, one of the main ways that he was doing the big cat cub photo op business was he was traveling around to malls and fairs, and he would do a magic show along with selling photo ops with big cats. And Big Cat Rescue would find out where he was going and send an alert to its supporters and ask its supporters to call the mall and ask them to cancel the performance. And they were able to get a lot of performances canceled that way. And in order to get revenge on Big Cat Rescue, Joe had a number of different names for his shows to try to throw Big Cat Rescue off his scent. And so he called one of his shows Big Cat Rescue Entertainment. So,
and this was supposed to make people think that this was an officially sanctioned event by the people who are coming after him. And did it work?
And it didn't work. Big Cat Rescue was getting angry calls from its supporters, and so it trademarked the Big Cat Rescue name. And Joe, despite the fact that Joe continued to use it, and they ended up suing Joe over violating their trademark, and ultimately got $1 million judgment against Joe.
$1 million?
That's right. That judgment stayed over Joe's head for years, and he tried to evade it. The judgment was against both him personally and the GW Exotic Animal Park, which was the name of his roadside zoo at the time. And so he declared personal bankruptcy in order to evade the judgment, and he dissolved the GW Exotic business and had a few of his friends at the zoo start a new business called the Gerald Wayne Exotic Animal Park, where in which Joe was not a principal but simply an employee. Big Cat Rescue went after that entity, and so then Joe dissolved that entity, and he sold his business to a man named Jeff Lowe, who opened up the Greater Wynnewood Exotic Animal Park. Big Cat Rescue went after that entity, and so, this has just kept going on, and Joe hasn't been able to escape this judgment. He was eventually making payments on the judgment around the time that his husband died in a gun accident. No foul play involved, huh? The authorities didn't find any foul play. Apparently, his name was Joe's husband's name was Travis, and he was apparently trying to show some friends that this particular type of handgun that he had, it wouldn't go off if there was some particular thing done to the gun, but he'd emptied the gun of bullets, but he'd forgotten the bullet in the chamber, and he'd put the gun up to his head, and so he shot himself in the head and died. So, around that time, Joe attempted to hire two different people to kill Carol, apparently in an attempt to get out of that. Big Cat Rescue was so effective, they had this hanging over Joe no matter where he was. Then all these things happened in his life. He must have felt like essentially like a trapped animal in order to go or to resort to a murder for hire. Thankfully he didn't succeed in his plot, and Carol is alive and well today. Yeah, so he went after Carol not once, but if first you don't succeed, try again. He tried a second time, and he failed. What period of time was this? When did this happen? We don't know exactly when it happened, but it would have been around the fall of 2016. He first tried to hire a zoo employee, went as far as buying him a burner phone and giving him several $1,000s up front and the employee set off apparently for Florida to kill her, but the man he hired was, as most of the employees at Joe's facility were, was a drug addict, and he apparently used the money to buy alcohol and drugs and never even made it to Florida. So then the second person that he tried to hire turned out to be an undercover FBI agent.
Well, that was unfortunate for Joe, but it was good for the animals.
That's right, and certainly for Carol as well.
Were there other targets? I understand that he made death threats against PETA, against Ingrid Newkirk, the president of PETA, and even you. But they were different from the death threats, I guess. Were they just idle, loud talk, or was it? Did you ever feel threatened by his words?
We always take any death threat seriously, and Joe at a time had a reality show that he was broadcasting over the internet, and at one time it was airing every night. And so a lot of times the show was just him ranting about Carol Baskin or Big Cat Rescue, often PETA or Ingrid. He did occasionally mention me. On one of those shows, he shot up an effigy of Ingrid, and we reported that to the FBI. We don't know if they investigated or not. We never heard anything else about it, but we certainly took it seriously enough to report it to the authorities.
Were you ever scared by any of his threats?
No. I mean, when it eventually got to the point where I knew that I was going to be going to the facility and that Joe knew that I was going to be there, we did hire armed security guards to go with us just to make sure that we would be safe.
Tell me about that first time you encountered him, and how did he react to you back then?
Yeah, it was in the fall of 2016, and I was at the facility with a team from the Wild Animal Sanctuary rescuing 19 tigers that had been sent to Joe by a facility in Florida that PETA is suing under the Endangered Species Act. And that facility was attempting to abort PETA's court-ordered site inspection. They thought that if they just sent all of their tigers away, that PETA wouldn't be able to do the inspection. And so PETA ended up being tipped off about the transfer of the tigers by Joe himself, who posted about it on Facebook. And so we were able to go to the court and get a preliminary injunction.
He put it on Facebook. That doesn't sound like a very smart move.
Right. Well, Joe wasn't necessarily the most savvy guy, and he didn't explicitly say which facility it was coming from, but he said 19 tigers coming from Florida, and there was really only one roadside zoo in Florida at the time that would have that many tigers, and certainly that would be looking to get rid of that many tigers on an emergency basis. So we knew right away what this was.
You went to Oklahoma.
That's right.
And there he was. And your job was to get the cats, or to try to intercept the cats or get the cats and bring them to safety, right?
Well, after the cats were moved to Oklahoma, they were moved in violation of a federal court order. So at that point, Joe was potentially an accessory, or he was an accessory to violating that court order. And so in order to avoid any liability with the federal court, we were able to come to an agreement in which he allowed us to take, or he allowed the Wild Animal Sanctuary to provide permanent homes for all 19 of those tigers. And so that's why we were there on that day in 2016 with the armed security to get those 19 tigers.
Yeah, were you scared then? I mean, you're there with armed security.
Joe wasn't supposed to be there. We didn't want him to interfere with the transfer team. But of course, as we were standing out in the parking lot, preparing the plan to go in, Joe came out. And so then it became my job to keep Joe occupied and away from the rescue team so that they could get the animals out quickly and safely.
Boy, here's Joe Exotic. He hates PETA. He's made threats against you. Weren't you a little frightened when you were talking to him?
Well, he was quite affable, and we did have quite a few armed guards with us, but ultimately our objective was to get the animals out of there, and it doesn't help the situation to be scared. We were there and we had a job to do, and that took precedence. There wasn't really room in our brains for anything else.
You were there for the animals.
That's right.
So when you got there and you're in the parking lot, describe the situation even before he comes out and you see him. What it look like? What did it smell like? How big was it? I mean, you've seen pictures of this place, but describe for our listeners what it was like.
Right. I'd seen photos, lots of photos and videos of the place over the years, but I'd never been there myself. And when you're standing out in the parking lot, even before you get into the facility, and there were solid walls separating the parking lot from the facility itself, but you're immediately overcome with the overwhelming stench of urine. And that's because Joe has these cell blocks, these tiny cages, 10 by 10 cages, most of which have 2 tigers to a cage. They're on these packed dirt floors that are just packed with years of caked on urine, and the stench of urine just overwhelms everything, even out in the parking lot. So then you go in and it's just cage upon cage upon cage of tigers. He also had a number of other animals. There were bears and monkeys and chimpanzees and skunks and camels, almost any animal that you could imagine on this tiny 1 acre property, most of which wasn't even animal enclosures.
Would there be like 50, 60, 100?
There were hundreds of animals on the property.
Hundreds of animals. Wow.
Yeah.
And so you get this stench, you go in, it's worse than you thought?
Absolutely. It's hard to know. I mean, I knew that it was going to be a horrific facility, but I wasn't prepared for the scope of the suffering of so many animals on one tiny piece of property, and the squalor that they were living in. There were 3 juvenile black bears who were living in an enclosure that was one of the most disgusting things that I've ever seen. There was feces everywhere. They could barely walk anywhere without stepping in their own waste. It was covered in trash. I mean, clearly no one was cleaning these enclosures.
You got to talking to Joe. He's affable, and your job was to just keep him talking while you were getting the animals out, right?
That's right. And Joe's husband, Travis, had died just a month or 2 before this, and he wasn't in a good psychological state of mind, certainly. And he said that he really wanted to get out of the business. He claimed that he'd realized that it was in fact cruel to tear baby cubs away from their mothers to use them in encounters and photo ops, and that he didn't want to do that anymore, but that the only way that he could continue making payments on the judgment was if he did these encounters and continued to sell cats. So he said that he was sort of looking to PETA to help him get out of the industry, and he said that he would be willing to provide us with information about others in the industry to help us to take them down, because he said that he thought that others in the industry weren't helping him during his time of need in ways that he'd helped them.
So this was kind of like a kind of deathbed conversion. He was caught. He was going to retire, get out of the business, and go to, I believe he was going to go to Belize and be a bartender. And he just wanted to make things right, or were you still a little suspicious?
I can't believe anything that Joe says. Everything has to be taken with a grain of salt. But yes, he said that all he wanted was to retire to Belize to be a bartender. Of course, I didn't know at the time that he was in the process of hiring a hitman to try to kill Carol. So of course he would want to be fleeing the country. But there was a potential opportunity for us to help these animals. And he was, at the time, the biggest abuser of big cats in the country. And if there was any chance of being able to save even one animal from him, we had to take that opportunity. So after that day, Joe and I kept in touch.
And ultimately, he did get arrested and convicted. Describe the arrest and describe what he was convicted for.
So Joe was ultimately arrested in Florida in September of 2018 after being indicted on 2 counts of murder for hire and 17 counts of federal wildlife crimes, including for trafficking in endangered species, mostly tigers, and 7 of those charges were over Joe shooting 7 tigers with shotguns so that he could make room for other tigers he was being paid to board.
What kind of time is he facing for, what he was convicted for?
So Joe is facing up to 30 years in prison on all of the charges. He hasn't been sentenced yet. He was convicted in April of 2019. He's still awaiting sentencing in October of 2019, though we expect sentencing to take place immediately.
One of the things that gets me is that as you stayed in contact with Joe Exotic, he actually asked you to testify on his behalf. I mean, after he threatens you, he's put out these death threats, you're his only witness he calls? That had to astonish you a little bit, huh?
I'm still not quite sure why Joe's attorneys chose to do that, but I was not only subpoenaed to testify for Joe's defense, I was the only witness for Joe's defense other than Joe himself.
And what did you say?
I testified and I told the truth, but I don't think that I did Joe's case any favors because I did tell the truth. I told the truth about how when I first met Joe, it was in relation to the fact that he'd just been an accessory to violating a federal court order, and that I knew about Joe previously because of his reputation as being the biggest tiger abuser and exploiter and trafficker in the United States. And those were exactly the types of things that he was on trial for.
Just to give our audience a sense of just how severe these crimes are, I mean, he was convicted of taking hits out twice, for murder, but also how significant were all these animal crimes of transporting and keeping the animals, and just give a sense of the severity of what he did.
Well, we're hoping that Joe's arrest and conviction on these wildlife crimes will have a much bigger effect, because one of the things that we've seen over the years is that people like Joe, these people who are doing the big cat encounters and trafficking in endangered species, they've been able to do it for decades with impunity because the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, which enforces the Endangered Species Act, hasn't shown an inclination to enforce the law in relation to captive members of endangered species, even though the captive members of the species are clearly included within the ESA. So this is one of the first times that we've seen someone being charged for trafficking big cats, furtherance of a scheme, a big cub petting scheme, and also one of the first times that we've seen someone charged for killing a captive endangered species. So we're hoping that this will just be the first, and that the feds are continuing to investigate others in the industry. That remains to be seen, but certainly it will hopefully have a chilling effect on others within the industry who are now hopefully realizing that by doing this, they could be facing years in federal prison.
All right, maybe it'll happen. Maybe people out there will take a cue and say, oh, this is Joe Exotic. Are there more Joe Exotics out there, or is Joe Exotic one of a kind? What do you think?
Joe Exotic is certainly one of a kind, but there are definitely others out there who are trying to take his place in terms of tiger breeding. His former business partner, Jeff Lowe, is now running the zoo out there in Oklahoma and seems to be breeding cats just as quickly as or just as prolifically as Joe did. There are a few others in the industry. PETA has also been taking on this industry head on, and we have 2 Endangered Species Act pending right now, one in Florida and one in Indiana, trying to establish the first ever federal precedent establishing that prematurely separating tiger cubs or big cat cubs from their mothers and using those animals in public encounters violates the Endangered Species Act. So that has a chilling effect as well, because Endangered Species Act litigation or any kind of federal litigation like that costs hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And so that's enough to bankrupt most of these businesses. And so some of them have decided to get out of the business just because they don't want to face a lawsuit from PETA, which is great. But there are others out there, and we need to and are going to stop them as well.
Tell me about the animals from Joe Exotic. What happened to them? You did get them out. Where are they now?
We didn't get all of them out. So after I continued talking to Joe after we got those first 19 tigers out, one of the things he said that he wanted to do was to reduce his inventory to try to streamline his business, hopefully to make it easier to get out of the business when we eventually came up with a plan to do that. He agreed that as we took animals out, he would destroy the cages so that he couldn't put more animals in those same cages. So we were back in Oklahoma about a month after the first time, and we took out 20 additional tigers, 3 bears, and 2 baboons that time.
And what happened to them? Where did they go?
All of those animals were retired to sanctuaries. They were transferred to sanctuaries that day. The animals who were remaining when Joe left the property are still at the zoo.
So now you're waiting for sentencing. It could be imminent. It could come down. You're thinking he faces, 30 years, you said?
Yes, Joe is facing 30 years in prison on all 19 of the charges.
And does it look like there may be leniency, or you were the only witness for his defense, and it didn't sound like the things you were saying might lead a judge or a jury to be lenient at all.
We'll see. We really just don't know. So it was a jury trial, so the jury handed down the convictions. The judge will do the sentencing, and there will be an entire hearing where Joe could have people testify on his behalf, and the prosecution will make its own case about its proposed sentence.
Did they ask you to testify this time?
I have not been subpoenaed at this point.
Do you have any memories of Joe at this point that you'll never forget?
Well, we're still in contact. I visited him in jail a couple of months ago and spent a couple of days there with Joe and with his attorneys. He was sharing additional information and evidence with us that we'll hopefully be able to use to get some of his former colleagues out of business.
So he's still helpful in some ways for the animals. Do you trust it? Do you trust his instinct? Or is he just out there for revenge?
Well, we don't really care what his motivations are. Our objective is to help the animals, and so any evidence that he's able to provide, we're happy to use.
And he's been helpful?
He's been providing us with evidence, yes.
Well, Brittany, so the saga continues. It may be ongoing even after he's sent away, huh?
That's right.
Okay. All right, Brittany. Well, thank you for filling us in on Joe Exotic, whose real name once again is Joe
Maldonado Passage.
Maldonado Passage. And he was gay too, right?
That's right. Yes, he is. He
like a lot of animal guys, like the animal. I don't mean to stereotype them, but it's not exactly what you think of as you think of it as more like a macho jungle tamer kind of image. But did that surprise you when you met him and his husband had just died and he was in a, as you put it, a bad psychological place? Did you see the real Joe?
Who knows? Who knows what the real Joe looks like? But what I've seen in my years of working to try to shut big cat abusers in particular down is it's one of the personality traits that they seem to have in common is narcissism, and I think that's one of the reasons too that many of these people are so brazen with what they do. They truly think that they're immune and that nothing bad could ever happen to them.
Brittany Peet. Peet is Director for Captive Animal Law Enforcement on Joe Maldonado Passage, a.k.a. Joe Exotic, who is in prison now awaiting sentencing. For more, go to PETA.org. And that's our program. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund blog, that's aldef.org/blog, or AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.